how does emotional healing work? This video is a full guide, so you can understand how you can heal emotional wounds, what's the underlying process, and what are your next steps. Now, I worked with people over a longer period of time in the past, and I noticed it seems like we are healing emotional wounds, but I didn't understand how. Well, what was the underlying process? How did this work? And only afterwards, after like 2 years or so, I started to understand how this works. And I want to first of all share 3 different examples. One example will be even a personal of mine, where I felt like some emotional and psychological healing was happening. And then afterwards, we're going to talk about the underlying process, which was always similar though in those different examples. I want to share a little bit how emotional healing generally works. So here's the first example. I once had a client and we started working together, and we had a very good bonding early on and very safe environment that we somehow built. We had a very safe relationship. And she quite early on could talk about very personal topics, and even at some point she shared something with me that she never shared with anybody. Something from her past, something very painful from her childhood. And basically what we did is we simply talked about it. And I was curious. I also asked questions in between. I was like, hey, Kay, why did you do this back then? Or how was that? Or what did your father think about that? I basically was just there listening, asking questions, understanding with her what happened back in the days. And she was talking about this, and she was also crying. And I was not afraid of tears. I just let them be, just gave her a tissue. And that's what we basically did. And after a couple of weeks, we stopped working together. And I asked her, it feels like you're feeling better. It feels like some weight, she even said this, like some weight of her shoulders get lifted off and she feels more lighthearted. And the sessions with me helped her so much. And I asked her, what did we do? What was different? And the interesting thing is that actually before, she was working with another psychologist together. And I know this guy. It's actually a friend of mine. And this is one of the most loving friends I know, very compassionate, very patient, very good psychologist, I think. And the interesting thing is that she said, somehow I couldn't open up with this prior psychologist, but with you, Marco, like your eyes, somehow I felt so safe that I could talk about it. And I don't think that I'm a better psychologist. I'm not even think that I'm better at creating a safe space. I think my friend is at least as skilled as I am and as compassionate and loving. So somehow though something differently resonated, and I don't know what it was, but she felt simply safe to talk about that. And by talking about that and letting it out, somehow she felt relieved and lighthearted. That's the first example. Second example, I had a different client. He always felt like a burden. He always, he actually was running a business. Now he was working in the same business that he sold. And he said he always feels like a burden when he's calling the finance department and ask a question, when he's talking with his boss and want to pitch some new crazy ideas. He always feels like nobody has time for him. He is a burden. And I asked him at some point, what was the first feeling in your life when you felt like a burden? And he said, well, it was in my childhood. With my mother, was a single mother. We moved to a different country. Everything was difficult and she was struggling a lot. And I felt like I was the reason for that. Because if there are 2 people and one person is struggling, I need to be the reason for that. And that's when I felt like a burden. And that's basically a psychological wound that he was carrying around throughout life. And at some point we did the following. Actually, he once told me about a specific situation from his childhood when his mother cried, and this really felt like I am a burden. And we went through a visualization process where he actually, now being 30 years old, going back into his childhood, taking the car, driving to this area in his mind, visualizing it, going in this apartment and seeing this little child who is himself while his mother is crying. And he went up to this child, he looked into this child's eyes, he talked to this little kid and shared everything he felt like this kid needed to hear back then. And he even gave this little kid, who is himself, a hug, a loving hug in his visualization. And he cried. It was very relieving for him. And over the weeks, he said, Marco, I don't feel like a burden anymore. I don't feel any struggle. And I actually feel bored talking about this topic right now, but I don't know what we did. I mean, I knew it rationally before, but I was not there emotionally. And yes, we did those visualizations and worked emotionally on it. But I cannot rationally now say what happened and what changed. It just feels better. I just feel like this psychological wound doesn't exist anymore. That's the second example. The third example is something actually from my life. So there's a lot of research, by the way, into the field of psychedelics and using this with psychotherapy together. I don't want to go into depth right now. This is not what this video is about here. I actually have another video about psychedelics where I share the underlying psychology of that. But I was basically using psychedelics, and at some point, out of the blue, I was sitting there in the room, and out of nothing, suddenly a moment popped up. I felt like this little child again. And there was this one sentence coming up: let me be who I am. And I felt very much pain. I didn't even know that I had this pain back from this childhood, where I was struggling over a couple of years with a couple of things, and I didn't even thought that this would be something that I'm still carrying around, but it somehow popped up. And actually, while I was sitting there, I listened to a song that repeated. It was the same song over and over again, very emotional song. And I probably listened to the song like 10 times, and it always felt like I'm going through the same loop and the same childhood and kid that was struggling back in the days. And I cried like a waterfall. I just felt like this little child, and I just felt so much empathy to this kid that just wants to be who he is, but he couldn't. And after like repeating the song over and over again and feeling like I'm reliving this childhood over and over again and crying like a river, I also felt, just like this first client, like so much weight got lifted off my shoulders. And I felt like I healed emotionally. And I also didn't understand what happened there. Why? How did this happen? I mean, yeah, I basically knew what I was doing. I knew that it was helping, but I didn't understand why. What's the reason behind that? And then a couple of months later, I read a quote, a short quote that suddenly enlightened my understanding of emotional healing. It was summarizing basically everything that we did with those 3 examples. With the first woman that talked about her childhood and shared something she never shared before in her life. With the second guy where we did this visualization, going back into the past, having a conversation with his own little child, and me taking psychedelics. And the quote is the following: healing comes when we meet our wounded places with compassion. Healing comes when we meet our wounded places with compassion. And if you look back at those 3 examples, this is exactly what happened. We went back to the wounded places. So the woman talking about her experience she never talked about. The guy going back in his visualization, talking with this little child in the situation when he felt like a burden. And also me feeling like this little child again, feeling this pain. So I went back to this wounded place. And then on top of that, so just simply awareness is not enough. On top of that, we always met it with a lot of compassion. The first example, where we talked about what was going on in her childhood, I was simply there. I was compassionate. I was curious. I asked questions. I was engaged, and I gave her a safe space. With my other client who went through this visualization process, he met his little child. He shared support verbally, but also giving him a hug. He was there very much with a lot of compassion. And also lastly, me, who felt super compassionate about this little kid and what happened, and just understanding this child. So we met the wounded place with a lot of compassion. And that's how you heal emotionally. Now, simply doing this once is probably not the solution for everything, especially if there's something that happened over years and you don't just have a single session and then just it's released and snapped and everything is gone. That would be also in a sense disrespectful to your past. It's like living through something for years and then just having one session is fine. It takes a little bit of time, but it's a great starter. And if you then relive this and think this over a little bit and just let it sink in over a couple of months, that you become more compassionate with this wounded place, then you heal emotionally. Now, for some clients, I noticed that opening up to all that, first of all, makes it worse. Because they're getting confronted with something that they didn't think about a lot the last years. So first of all, they feel more distress. They even feel a little bit depressed in a sense. Because they start to acknowledge the negative emotions that are there. They become real in a sense. And then the emotional digestion is happening. So it's, by the way, quite common that it first of all gets worse. And to a degree, that's even a good sign because you start to digest. You're not playing tricks on your own mind anymore. You look at it as it is. And then you need to digest. It's some work. And that's negative emotions are part of that. It's kind of like you open a drawer and you look at all like the crumpled clothes and you take them all out and you fold them nicely again and then you put them back in the drawer and close it again. That's the process of emotional healing. But it's a little bit of work, right? You need to put it out, you need to fold it nicely again. But basically you clear your mind with this process. Yeah. And it's pretty much that simple. I know that there's this big barrier of like, how am I doing this now and how does this work and how can we go move forward? But as soon as you fully meet that wounded place with compassion, you know what I'm talking about. And you know that it is improving because you are noticing it physically. You cannot not notice it when it's going right. Okay. Now some people might still have now resistance and say, well, there's this emotional wound. I don't want to take a closer look. I don't want it to get worse. It's not worth the effort. I can just suppress it and not just face it anymore. Well, I understand that, but I think it is always worthwhile working on yourself if you feel safe enough. If you're running a business, you're just going through a divorce, and then you want to work on this third emotional wound that you're having here. Maybe it's a little bit too much at the same time. But if you have the capacity, I think working on that, the long-term effects will be so massive you don't even realize that yet. Even nowadays, you're still once in a while getting triggered by a couple of thoughts or emotions. Maybe you're still sometimes thinking about those events, or some people just trigger you and make you mad or angry. That is probably because you're having an emotional wound. If you work on that and if you heal, you don't get triggered by that so often anymore. Also, generally, you feel a greater sense of inner peace when you heal emotionally. You're more skillful at setting and maintaining boundaries, because if you're not healing emotionally, that means there still is a wound. That means you got hurt in the past. That means you're still a bit suspicious and afraid that you might get hurt again. So you don't want people to dislike you. So you're not as good as you could be in setting boundaries and maintaining your own boundaries. There's still a little bit of fear, still a little bit neurotic subconsciously. And also, if you heal emotionally, you're much better at welcoming support and others in your life. You can be full of love, or at least more, have a greater sense of feeling full of love and also sharing that with others. If you can, by yourself, not feel full of love, you cannot transfer this feeling to others. And if you cannot transfer this feeling to others, you're not attracting the most loving people. So there's so many benefits to win. Okay. And by the way, by doing this, everybody, maybe not everybody, but I'm in my head often thinking about this term self-actualization and growing as a human being. And this is exactly how this works. It starts with those emotional wounds that you're having, healing emotionally, making sure that the foundation is met. And then when you're more confident, much more full of love, you're not preoccupied with all the negativity anymore. And then you can move forward and ask yourself, who am I? What would I like to do? You're more resistant to social pressure. You have a better feeling of who you are, because this emotional wound that you're suppressing, in a sense, you're suppressing part of yourself. And with that, you also suppress other parts. But you want to fully understand yourself and who you are, and you cannot do this if you suppress parts of yourself and you're afraid to look at who you are and what happened in your life. So by also learning that, you simply become more authentic, have a greater sense of who you are. You can also express yourself better. You're more courageous in going for what you think is important in life. That all entails emotional healing. Okay. If you're now interested in meeting your wounded places with compassion, I suggest that we are talking. There's a link below the video. You can just sign up for a call with me. You can have a first free call, even build a custom strategy for your situation with your personality. And we can basically create a strategy how working together would look like, how you can overcome and heal emotionally. That's for free. So make use of that. There's a link below. Also share this video with anybody you feel like it might be helpful. With anybody where you feel like they're far away from compassion in meeting any wounded places. Share it with them. You might not know how helpful it might be for them. All right. I'll see you around. Have a good day.